History as California's oldest prison. The doors had already closed when the realization set in. There would be no immediate release, no sudden reversal, no quiet exit back into ordinary life. Inside these walls, time moves differently, and consequences echo longer than most people ever imagine. What happened here shaped not only inmates, but the institutions themselves. For decades, facilities like San Quentin Rehabilitation Center, Rikers Island, and Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary have stood as symbols of American incarceration, each carrying histories few truly understand. San Quentin Rehabilitation Center sits along the northern shore of San Francisco Bay, its gray walls facing open water and the skyline beyond, a stark reminder of distance between confinement and freedom. Established in 1852, it holds the distinction of being California's oldest prison, operating continuously through waves of reform, controversy, overcrowding, and shifting philosophies about punishment and rehabilitation. From its earliest days, San Quentin housed men convicted of serious crimes, including those sentenced to death, shaping its reputation as one of the most consequential institutions in the American correctional system. Unlike later supermax facilities, San Quentin was built in a time when prison architecture prioritized containment over classification, resulting in cell blocks that would later strain under modern population pressures. By the 20th century, its condemned unit drew national attention, as executions carried out within its walls marked some of the most debated moments in California's criminal justice history. The prison's gas chamber, later replaced by lethal injection protocols, became a focal point of legal battles and public protest, reflecting broader national arguments about capital punishment. But San Quentin was never defined solely by executions. Over time, it evolved into a complex institution balancing security needs with expanding educational and vocational programming. Its location in Marin County placed it near media centers and advocacy groups, ensuring that developments inside rarely remained hidden from public scrutiny. Overcrowding in the late 20th century intensified tensions, as California's tough-on-crime policies dramatically increased inmate populations across the state, including within San Quentin's aging infrastructure. Cells originally designed for one person often held two, placing pressure on staff and incarcerated individuals alike, reshaping daily routines in subtle but significant ways. Movement within the facility followed strict schedules, from early morning counts to structured meal times and limited recreation periods in designated yards. Inmates assigned to work programs maintained kitchens, laundry operations, and maintenance duties, forming the backbone of daily institutional function. San Quentin also became known for its media and journalism initiatives, including inmate-run publications that provided rare insight into life behind its walls. These programs did not erase the severity of sentences being served, but they complicated public perception of what long-term incarceration looked like in practice. Some of the state's most high-profile inmates passed through San Quentin, drawing national media coverage and reinforcing its symbolic weight in California's justice system. Yet daily life there often revolved around routine rather than spectacle, defined by counts, classification reviews, and adherence to institutional rules. Security levels within the prison varied, with different housing units reflecting custody classifications and behavioral assessments conducted by correctional staff. The condemned housing unit operated under stricter protocols, with increased supervision and controlled movement, distinguishing it from general population areas. Legal appeals could stretch for years, meaning some individuals remained on death row for decades while broader policy debates unfolded outside. Few people outside ever learned how those prolonged waits affected the institution's rhythm and resource allocation. Meanwhile, statewide reforms aimed at reducing overcrowding forced California officials to reconsider how older prisons like San Quentin functioned within the larger system. Court rulings addressing unconstitutional overcrowding conditions led to population reductions, shifting how space was used inside the facility. Educational offerings expanded in the early 21st century, including college-level courses designed to reduce recidivism through skill development. These initiatives reflected a broader reevaluation of incarceration's purpose, even as the prison continued housing individuals convicted of serious offenses. But reform did not erase San Quentin's past, and its history remained visible in aging cell blocks and long-standing security protocols. The name itself carried weight, often invoked in courtroom sentences as shorthand for consequence within California's penal landscape. Across the country in New York City, Rikers Island developed its own complex identity, though its structure and population differed sharply from San Quentin's. Rikers functions primarily as a jail, holding pretrial detainees and individuals serving shorter sentences, creating faster turnover and distinct operational challenges. Unlike long-term state prisons, its population fluctuates daily, influenced by arrest rates, court schedules, and bail determinations. That rapid churn has historically produced instability, and what followed in certain years surprised even experienced correctional officials. Rikers Island sits in the East River between Queens and the Bronx, a complex of jail facilities that for decades processed tens of thousands of people each year. Unlike San Quentin, Rikers operates under New York City's Department of Correction, primarily holding individuals awaiting trial or serving sentences shorter than 1 year. That distinction shapes everything inside, from intake procedures to housing assignments, because most detainees do not know how long they will remain there. The intake process begins quickly after arrest, with fingerprinting, medical screening, classification interviews, and housing placement often completed within hours. For many, uncertainty defines the experience more than sentence length, because court dates, bail decisions, and plea negotiations determine how long detention lasts. Over the years, Rikers has faced repeated scrutiny over conditions, including allegations of excessive force, inadequate supervision, and systemic overcrowding. Federal investigations documented patterns of violence among detainees and between staff and inmates, prompting court oversight and mandated reforms. But that was not the only challenge confronting the facility. Staff shortages have periodically strained operations, affecting response times, movement schedules, and access to programming across multiple housing units. Because Rikers houses adolescents, adults, and individuals with mental health needs, managing diverse populations requires layered classification and specialized housing areas. Mental health units attempt to separate vulnerable detainees from the general population, yet resources have not always kept pace with demand. Public defenders and advocacy groups argue that prolonged pretrial detention can pressure defendants into plea agreements, even before cases are fully heard. City officials have announced long-term plans to close Rikers and replace it with borough-based facilities, signaling a significant shift in New York's incarceration model. Yet closures require construction, funding, and political agreement, and until that transition is complete, daily operations continue on the island. Routine on Rikers revolves around counts, meal distribution, recreation periods, and movement to court appearances under tight security. Transport buses leave early in the morning, carrying detainees to courthouses across the city, sometimes returning late in the evening. That constant movement creates logistical complexity few outside the system ever see. Meanwhile, correction officers navigate crowded housing areas where tensions can rise quickly, especially among individuals facing uncertain legal outcomes. Court oversight has required new training protocols, use of force reporting systems, and body-worn camera implementation in certain units. But implementing reform inside a large jail complex is rarely immediate or uniform. Critics point to fluctuating violence statistics over different years, noting improvements in some areas and setbacks in others. The jail's physical isolation, accessible only by a single bridge, has long symbolized separation from the city it serves. For families, visitation often involves lengthy travel and security screening before brief, regulated contact. Advocates argue that stronger family connections can reduce misconduct and support successful reintegration after release. Yet short stays and frequent transfers complicate continuity in educational or therapeutic programming. Few people outside ever see how quickly a detainee's status can change with a single court ruling. While Rikers reflects the pressures of urban pretrial detention, another institution across the country once represented federal authority at its most rigid. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary operated on a rocky island in San Francisco Bay, holding individuals considered particularly disruptive within other federal prisons. Opened as a federal prison in 1934, it was designed to impose stricter discipline and tighter control than most facilities of its era. Inmates at Alcatraz were typically transferred there after repeated rule violations elsewhere, reinforcing its reputation as a last resort placement. The daily routine was tightly structured, with mandatory silence during certain hours and limited privileges compared to other institutions. Its isolation by cold, fast-moving water created a natural barrier that discouraged escape attempts, though several did occur. The most famous 1962 escape attempt involving Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers remains officially unresolved, fueling public fascination decades later. But beyond escape stories, Alcatraz represented a federal experiment in concentrated control over a small, highly monitored population. Operating costs eventually became unsustainable, and deteriorating infrastructure contributed to its closure as a prison in 1963. What remained, however, was a powerful symbol of confinement that continues to shape public imagination. Few visitors walking its corridors today fully grasp how different its daily reality was from the myths surrounding it. When people compare San Quentin, Rikers Island, and Alcatraz, they often focus on reputation, but the deeper story lies in how each reflects a different era of American incarceration. San Quentin's longevity mirrors California's shifting policies, from 19th-century punishment models to modern debates about rehabilitation, overcrowding, and the future of capital punishment. For decades, its death row housed the largest condemned population in the Western Hemisphere, even as executions were halted under statewide moratoriums and legal challenges. That pause reshaped the institution, converting parts of death row and reconsidering how space and staffing would be used moving forward. In recent years, California announced plans to transform San Quentin into a rehabilitation-focused facility, emphasizing education, job training, and reentry preparation. Supporters argue this approach addresses recidivism more directly, while critics question how change will unfold within a structure built in 1852. But that tension between history and reform is not unique to California. New York City's plan to close Rikers Island represents one of the most ambitious jail reform efforts in the United States. The proposal calls for replacing the island complex with smaller borough-based facilities designed to be closer to courts and families. City officials cite safety concerns, infrastructure decay, and persistent oversight findings as reasons for pursuing closure. Yet construction delays, budget constraints, and political debate have slowed the timeline, extending Rikers' operational life beyond initial targets. Meanwhile, daily life on the island continues under court-monitored reform agreements requiring staffing adjustments and improved oversight. Few outside observers realize how complex it is to wind down a jail system that processes thousands of admissions each year. Alcatraz, by contrast, ended its prison chapter decades ago, but its legacy continues through tourism and historical preservation. Now managed by the National Park Service, it receives millions of visitors who walk cellhouse corridors once defined by strict silence. Interpretive exhibits present documented histories of incarcerated individuals, correctional staff, and the Native American occupation of 1969. That occupation reframed the island's meaning, connecting it to broader conversations about indigenous rights and federal land policy. In this way, Alcatraz evolved from an active prison into a site of layered historical narratives. San Quentin remains active, though rebranded as a rehabilitation center, signaling California's attempt to redefine its oldest prison's identity. Rikers remains active as well, caught between present obligations and future plans for closure. Each institution demonstrates how incarceration systems adapt slowly, often under legal pressure, public scrutiny, or fiscal necessity. Their differences also reveal how local, state, and federal authorities approach confinement in distinct ways. San Quentin houses long-term state prisoners, including those serving life sentences, reflecting California's sentencing framework. Rikers primarily detains individuals awaiting trial, highlighting the impact of bail systems and case backlogs on incarceration rates. Alcatraz once confined federal inmates deemed especially difficult to manage elsewhere, representing centralized federal authority. But beyond policy distinctions, all three institutions shaped lives through structured routines and restricted movement. Counts, classification reviews, disciplinary hearings, and controlled visitation defined daily experience across these facilities. What changed over time were the philosophies guiding those routines. Rehabilitation programs expanded in some eras, while security measures intensified in others, depending on political climate and public opinion. Legal rulings repeatedly forced corrections departments to reconsider overcrowding, medical care, and use of force policies. Few reforms happened quickly, and most followed years of litigation, investigation, and negotiation. Public perception often lags behind policy change, leaving reputations frozen in earlier decades. San Quentin is still widely associated with executions, even during years when none occurred. Rikers is frequently linked to violence, even as oversight efforts attempt measurable improvements. Alcatraz remains synonymous with escape legends, despite operating as a prison for less than 3 decades. These narratives persist because prisons symbolize consequence in its most concrete form. Yet behind those symbols are systems shaped by legislation, budgets, court orders, and human decision-making. Understanding that complexity requires looking beyond headlines toward documented history and verified outcomes. The future of incarceration in the United States remains contested, with reform efforts unfolding unevenly across jurisdictions. San Quentin's transformation, Rikers' proposed closure, and Alcatraz's preservation each mark different responses to that uncertainty. They stand not as identical institutions, but as milestones in an evolving national debate. If the story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.